in Revelation. The seventh trumpet. The seventh angel sounded his trumpet. And there were loud voices in heaven which said, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Messiah, and he will reign forever and ever." And the 24 elders who were seated on their thrones before God fell on their faces and worshiped God, saying, "We give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, the one who is and who was, because you have taken your great power and have begun to reign. The nations were angry, and your wrath is come. The time has come for judging the dead, and for rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your people who revere your name, both great and small, and for destroying those who destroy the earth." Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the ark of his covenant. And there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and a severe hailstorm. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness, to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short." When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. May the Lord bless his scripture and his reading. Now James will come and make sense to all of this. And we'll know all about it when he finishes his sermon. Here you go.
Good morning. Revelation is such a beautiful book. It's really a masterpiece of the New Testament. And some of this apocalyptic imagery is really inspiring and beautiful and wonderful, and but also kind of frightening. And I know that there's some people who don't read it because they're kind of afraid of what it might be saying. But as Christians, I think it's really a message that calls us to hope and calls us to look into our reality and see how God is at work and see how God will be at work and how God's faithfulness endures into the future. You might be surprised to learn that one of my favorite Christmas movies, might be surprising for a Quaker pastor to say this, but one of my favorite Christmas movies is really Die Hard, the classic Bruce Willis movie. And I don't know, you've probably all seen it, it's a really old movie, but in that movie, Willis plays this cop from New York who's out of his element, and he's on the other side of the country. He's in LA, and he's trying to win back his wife who's taken a job out there. And he's coming to visit her on Christmas, and he goes to this big corporate party where where his wife is at work. There's all these people, and in typical Hollywood fashion, the whole thing gets taken over by terrorists, and he gets to be the hero that saves the day. But one of the things that I appreciate about the movie is that Christmas isn't just Christmas in its predictable fashion. It's the backdrop for this battle of good and evil. And I think one of the things that Revelation points out for us here is that Christmas Day really was an epic battle between good and evil. When we think about Christmas, we think about Jesus as the hero, but also we think about him mostly as a baby. We think about the newborn king, but we don't really think too much about the conquering king. And Revelation gives us this perspective on Christmas, this perspective that's missing from the Gospels. And this really is part of the Gospel story that we can celebrate as an epic battle, one that started even before the garden, one that started in heaven. John invites us to see the Gospel, the story from this heavenly perspective. And the Lamb's War that is being waged in the book of Revelation isn't something that God started. It's something that God will finish. But it's something that wasn't even started in the garden. It was started in heaven. As the person who was the first deceiver turned heaven in rebellion, and the devil was cast down. And in Genesis, we see how human sin entered the garden and brought about the fall of the human race and the fracturing of creation. But in Revelation, we get to see some more of the backstory, even than Genesis gives us. And we also get to see some new details about how this all ends. And we get to see the incarnation a little bit differently. The Gospels don't say much about how the devil was at work trying to thwart the plans of God as Jesus was born. But John speaks of the birth of Christ as if the deceiver was there like a dragon, waiting for Jesus to be born, waiting to gobble him up the second that he came kicking and screaming into the world. So there's a lot of imagery in this passage, and I don't want to confuse you, and there's some things that I just can't preach on every single verse. So I don't want to confuse you, and I just want to talk about these key movements in this section that we just read. The final trumpet blast has opened us into this drama of Revelation and a new kind of part of the journey. And there are voices and signs in this. There's voices that come from heaven, and there's also these signs, the devil and the woman who are giving birth. And really the voices help us see the timeless perspective of heaven. And the woman and the dragon help us see the gospel story anew in a different way. And so I've broken down my message into looking at these voices and looking at these signs and getting to see what they teach us and what they tell us about God's story of redemption. When I was 9 years old, in 1989, the voice of Ronald Reagan rang out with these words: "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." And it was a big deal in school. It was a big deal in our world to see the Cold War ending, to see this inauguration of a new reality. And I think, despite the wall very much still being there as those words were spoken, as the words rang out, there was still a change in reality. There was something new that had been catalyzed in people's hearts and minds, namely life without the wall. And that reality was calling itself into being. It was desiring to be in being so big that people couldn't wait to get started. And this whole thing came about to end the wall as reality caught up to this dream that had been made alive in the hearts and minds of the people of Russia. And I think in a similar way, as we look at the first voice here that declares that the kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Messiah, and he will reign forever, it is a voice that calls out for reality to catch up. It is to inaugurate a new reality. And the drama unfolds in such a way as to show us how this new reality of God's reign will take place. And so the voices of heaven introduce us to the reign of God. And then the 24 elders representing the fullness of the people of God, both the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles, are seen giving thanks for God, giving thanks for what they are about to see, giving thanks that justice will come, giving thanks that those who have experienced injustice in the world will see that they have earned their reward, that their righteousness has not been overlooked as God's kingdom fully comes. And so the seventh trumpet has sounded, and now comes the final voice of inauguration. God's reign had actually come in its fullness. There wouldn't be a dragon to talk about. There wouldn't be the next two beasts that are coming also, this unholy trinity that we see in the book of Revelation. And the dragon would not be making trouble on earth. So I think what John is, I would argue for is that as John says this, he's saying this is what we're to pay attention to as we read what we're reading. As God's reign comes, as creation is drawn back into redemption, as the healing begins, the damage of evil must first be stopped. And that's what we get to see. And this time is drawing very, very close. Next we see the two signs that John is talking about that have been revealed from the temple in heaven. We see the pregnant woman. We also see the dragon pursuing the baby. And later, the mother's other descendants. And the woman is clothed in the sun with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars in her head. And the woman we see a mix of images. We see that the snake corresponds to the dragon corresponds to the snake in the Garden of Eden. And so this woman also corresponds to Eve, the woman who was in the Garden of Eden. And like the dragon, this is a cosmic figure. She's clothed in the sun, and she's putting her feet, resting her feet on the moon. This is a cosmic dimension that we're talking about here. But it also, it goes from Eve into the children of Israel as the 12 stars are in her crown, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, through which the Messiah would come. And also, of course, representing Mary, who would come, the very woman who would bring forth the Messiah into the world. In Genesis 3:15, we see how all of this is connected, and the curse of God, as God comes, and after Adam and Eve have sinned, God brings this curse. He brings a curse on the snake. He brings a curse on humanity, essentially. And in a part of the curse on the snake, in Genesis 3:15, God says that he will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. And he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. And this shows how this is all connected. We have Eve, we have the children of Israel, we have Mary, we have the Messiah. All of it works together. So even in that curse, God prophesied essentially about how this would be fulfilled. And so this points beyond the curse to the descendant of the woman, the man that comes from Eve, who would break the curse and prevail over the snake. It points to Jesus, the Messiah. And this enmity points us to the Lamb's War that we see in Revelation. This isn't something that God started. It's something that came even before, even before the deceiver entered the garden. And next we have the second sign, the dragon, connected with the serpent of old, the first deceiver of the garden, now envisioned as this enormous dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. And we learn how before the serpent was even in the garden, the deceiver had started his war, a coup that wasn't strong enough to succeed. And as Jesus described seeing how the devil was hurled from heaven, and Jesus didn't talk about his followers, but his followers were also hurled from heaven, and how this war has continued even down in our place on the earth, and it's pretty much picked up right where it left off. And the deceiver has come to lead the whole world astray. And so this is really interesting because it gets us to a backstory that we don't get to see in Genesis. We don't get to see in the Gospels. We only get to see this backstory here in Revelation. We see how the gospel story is made more complete when we look at it through the perspective of heaven. We see the raging frustrations and impotence of the evil trying to thwart the plans of God. We also see the gospel story presented differently from this perspective of heaven. This is something, the gospel story is a story of cosmic dimensions. It's the big story. It's now shown as the ultimate battle between good and evil. And at the birth of Jesus, evil was doing its best to rise up, to strike the Messiah as most vulnerable. And before Jesus could bring the message of hope to the world, the devil was already at work. And at Jesus' birth, Jesus was in danger. We know from King Herod trying to slaughter the boys of Bethlehem. And the angel warned them to flee and leave. But this wasn't just King Herod that was at work. This was the devil at work. And we're seeing the spiritual reality underneath what was going on in the Christmas story. And we see how this river was spewed out trying to attack this woman. And it was swallowed up by the earth. And we see the impotence of the dragon who is now trying to come after the Messiah with this rage against God's people. And this cosmic struggle that's been raging since the beginning of the garden, since even before the garden, now rages on. The persecution of the church, the experience of the people of God who are persecuted under this harsh emperor, through this harsh reality that they face. And so to all this struggle, we see an answer in the great and final voice calling from heaven. A pronouncement has been made about how, despite the faithful of God being persecuted, they can trust that they are on the right side of history. Despite Christians being persecuted and prosecuted and executed even for daring to stand up to the emperor, for daring to say, this is a false God. I will not worship him. I will give glory only to God. And despite suffering a martyr's death for that, God's promise will overcome all of it. The great war of the Lamb will be won. And it will be won through the blood of the Lamb, through the word of our testimony as the church. And so here we see that Revelation has this profound message of hope. It's flipping of perspectives. What looks like the victory of the persecutors from an earthly perspective is really, from a heavenly perspective, all about the victory of God. And the message of Revelation is not that God will take the people from the earth and take them away before they experience pain and suffering and tribulation. A lot of people, and we could talk about the rapture and how people try to put the rapture into the text of Revelation, which it's not really there. They want to put the rapture in there because they want God to take the people of God away before the suffering comes. That's not how God does it. That's not what the text of Revelation tells us about how God does it anyway. And so God is a God who calls us to go through that suffering, to be faithful in the midst of that suffering, and to continue to bear witness. And that's our calling. And so, in spite of the darkness, in spite of the suffering of the world, we're still called to be faithful. We're still called to declare with our lives that God is winning the battle, even if that means that we become martyrs for our faith. There's this great movie called The Imitation Game. It's got Benedict Cumberbatch in it. And Benedict Cumberbatch plays a man named Alan Turing, who is the father of the modern digital computer. And If you didn't know, World War II was won by the creation of the digital computer. And Benedict Cumberbatch's character, Alan, is, and I'll just let you know, I mean, it's a great movie. I would recommend that you see it, but you should know that it's told through our modern concerns. Alan Turing was a homosexual man who experienced a lot of persecution during his time, not accepting him for as he was. But even despite all of that, it's a great movie. And it's a great movie because it does a really great job of showing how the war was actually won, and the cost involved, and what was really at stake and the gravity of this situation. And so after the code was cracked in World War II, after years of labor finally produced this machine that could break the code, the war was now waged in secret. And the Allies at many points knew that something bad was going to happen on their side. They could intercept this message that would say this town was going to be bombed. And instead of just stopping that thing from happening, like you or I would probably want to do, God let it happen, or they let it happen, because if they just acted, they would know that they had broken the code. And so they did the opposite of what you and I would do. They strategically let some people die and suffer so that the big battle would be won, to protect the fact that the code had been broken from being discovered. And they figured out how to turn the tide of war a little bit at a time, to engineer the victory by strategically losing some battles, by living with the consequences of letting some tragedies happen so that overall they would prevail. And ultimately, in the end, they won the war. And so I think there's a lot of parallels here in the Lamb's War, in our part to play as potentially maybe even martyrs. You know, I don't understand the mystery of God. I don't understand why God lets good people who love him suffer. But I believe it has something to do with, as we talked about last week, something to do with how God can work through us as we live out our faith in the hard times. Sometimes that's the only way that God can reach people, by us sharing our faith and our hope in the midst of hard and difficult circumstances. But I also believe it has something to do with the sovereignty of God working strategically, just like with Alan Turing, just like with World War II, how we bring about the win by being a part in this. And sometimes I think God is orchestrating and engineering the world so that the most amount of people will be saved. There's something going on in this. And as Christians, I think we need to accept the sovereignty of God even over our suffering. We need to be reminded to put our trust that God sees the picture, the big picture, better than we do. That there is a plan. And just like in the Imitation Game, the Lamb is winning this war. There are secret objectives that God is up to that we might not understand, that we might not appreciate until one day when it's all over. We get to see that we were on the right side of history. We get to see the real plan of God at work. And it might sound a little bit blasphemous for me to say this, or to even think this, but sometimes I wonder if God's heart is still reaching out to this ancient serpent, still hoping that the devil will come around in repentance. You know, Scripture is silent on that. It's not something that I'm teaching here. But sometimes I wonder if the heart of God is at work in this struggle as well. Sometimes I wonder, is that what God's waiting for? Is it just a big story like the prodigal son, of God still extending grace to this serpent, still reaching out for love, still wanting even the devil to be redeemed? We played The Voyage of the Dawn Treader in the park, our last movie in the park, and it's a really good movie. And in that, there's a story of this teenage boy whose name is Eustace, who's turned into a dragon. And that hard-hearted dragon eventually gets his scales removed by recognizing his need for Aslan, the Christ figure in the story, and for asking for forgiveness and for asking for God's help, essentially. And it's this beautiful picture of redemption as in the book, as the dragon scales are removed from this boy, and he turns back into the boy that he was always supposed to be. And so in the book we see how the boy becomes a dragon, but we also see how the dragon turns from a dragon into a child of God. And I know that's not how Revelation ends here for the dragon. I mean, I've read the story, I know where this is going. But I wonder sometimes if that's how God would want it to end. If only the dragon was willing. If only the dragon would repent and turn back on the way that it should. And the scriptures tell us that God is desiring that no one would perish. And that includes everyone. That includes probably even all of God's creatures, all of God's creation. And I think that's what C.S. Lewis is pointing at in his story with Eustace. How the grace and forgiveness and love of God is so powerful that even if the devil would repent, that God's grace would be enough for that. But whatever God's reason for waiting, we also know how God does achieve his victory. We see how God long ago hurled down the devil from heaven along with his angels, and we see how the devil will lose the war here on earth as well. And he will be thrown down again, even further. And this time for good. And in the end, how God wins. Despite all of our suffering, despite all the struggling that we have to tell the gospel story, to tell how God's grace has come into our lives and changed our hearts, we get to see that God is at work not just in the small, not just inside of us, but in the big picture, in the cosmic. Revelation calls us to see our place in the drama. It calls us to bring our earthly perspective, including our sufferings, before God, and to have our perspective transformed by the reality and the perspective of heaven that we're offered here. In the end, God wins, and that's worth celebrating. The Lamb is worthy. He's worthy of our worship. He's worthy of our praise. And at times, I think we lose this perspective. It's easy for us in the midst of suffering to lose our hope. It's easy, as we find ourselves under attack, to stop caring about that, to stop thinking about the Lamb's war, to stop thinking about the objectives of God, to turn inward and be wounded and make it all about us rather than this big cosmic story that we're a part of. And that's why I think we need to hear the message of Revelation, because the Lamb is worthy, and it's worth it to offer our sacrifice to him. It's worth it to hold fast to our testimony about who Jesus is, even in the midst of suffering. And as the cosmic battle for good and evil rages, as it rages from heaven, as it rages in the garden, as it rages in our hearts, we can trust that the battle has already been won. Despite the story of redemption still working itself out in us and through us, and how God uses us to bear witness for him. And so, as we go into open worship, I want you to use this time to think about how your perspective has changed from your encounter with God, and how it might change further to take this heavenly perspective into yourself, to see the world as God sees the world, to see the battle for good and evil and your part that you play in it as something that's bigger than us, something that offers hope to the world, and something to which God will answer, ultimately with justice and truth and righteousness, as God's reign fully comes, as the devil is struck down. And we get to see that we were on the right side of history, and how God was using us the whole time to bring about the redemption of every single person that can be saved. And so as we go into this time, just pray that you would center on that. Think about your role, and think about what that role might mean as we let our perspectives be changed.